Welcome to all of you. Actually, I've planned to speak in French, if that's okay. Donc, pour changer un petit peu, on va parler en français. Donc, un bienvenue à vous toutes et à vous tous, chers étudiants, chers collègues, chers amis, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue à l'Institut pour cette discussion interdisciplinaire entre architecture, art et relations internationales. On a des petites cigales qui mettent un peu d'ambiance. Le titre de cette discussion peut sembler, au premier abord, un peu cryptique. Ça, c'est nous, les sciences sociales. Parfois, on est un petit peu cryptique. Performing Diplomacy, Specializing Transnational Publics. La réalité est en fait plus simple, comme souvent, que les mots qui sont choisis pour la décrire. Il est clair que l'on oublie trop souvent dans les sciences sociales que les dynamiques sociales, politiques, humaines s'inscrivent dans des lieux, dans des espaces et dans des dynamiques spatiales, qui les sculptent, les façonnent, les font résonner d'une manière ou d'une autre. Dit autrement, les dynamiques spatiales sont des ingrédients actifs qui peuvent transformer, réinventer les dynamiques sociales. Transformer l'espace, la forme et l'esprit du lieu, c'est réinventer l'interaction, mais aussi potentiellement la substance de ce que cette interaction va produire. À l'Institut, nous sommes profondément convaincus de ce rôle de nudging structurel, on peut l'appeler aussi comme ça avec un autre mot compliqué, que la spatialisation et l'architecture des lieux au sens large peuvent jouer. Nous en sommes tellement convaincus que nous sommes en fait en train de nous l'appliquer à nous-mêmes. Nous avons lancé un processus collectif et co-constructif de transformation spatiale interne, avec précisément pour objectif, derrière ce projet, de transformer la manière dont nous vivons et dont nous faisons la recherche. Donc on vous en dira plus le jour où ce sera abouti, mais c'est en cours. Nous sommes aussi convaincus à l'Institut qu'une transformation, si ce n'est une réinvention du multilatéralisme, est nécessaire et que la déspatialisation ou la respatialisation, là aussi, vont jouer un rôle important. Nous devons créer de nouveaux lieux, des espaces d'expérimentation en particulier, afin de créer des ponts déjà entre les hautes murailles des organisations existantes, mais aussi entre ces organisations et une multiplicité beaucoup plus large de parties prenantes externes. Nous devons construire des systèmes d'irrigation, pour continuer de filer la métaphore, qui vont permettre de canaliser des sources d'idées nouvelles et de les faire se rencontrer dans des espaces et dans des lieux inédits. Je crois tout particulièrement au rôle que peuvent jouer dans ce contexte ceux que j'appelle les voisins de la place des Nations et du parc Rigaud, avec des initiatives qui se multiplient autour de ce parc, de ce lieu, et dont je me réjouis. Je n'en mentionnerai ici que quelques-unes. Le parc Rigaud, son potager partagé, qui est maintenant présent depuis 2 ans et dans lequel l'Institut est impliqué aux côtés de l'Hospice Général et de la ville et maintenant de plus en plus d'autres voisins à travers la pépinière. Le travail que sont en train de réaliser les élèves d'architecture de l'EPFL et que nous avons accueilli dans ces murs même, dans cette salle même, je pense, ici, il y a quelques semaines, et le rôle tout particulier du Musée international de la Croix-Rouge et du Croissant-Rouge, qui est un moteur important de cette dynamique. Je tiens à souligner le rôle particulier de son très dynamique et très innovant directeur Pascal Schmitt, qui est ici, donc un rôle qu'il joue depuis maintenant son arrivée, à peu près en même temps que la mienne d'ailleurs, à la tête de cette belle institution, dans cette dynamique d'exploration de la spatialisation et de son impact. Je me réjouis d'ores et déjà de la suite de toutes ces initiatives où le travail sur l'espace va rejaillir sur la substance et va venir secouer, transformer et à terme sans doute réinventer la Genève internationale. L'Institut compte bien continuer à jouer en effet un rôle important dans cette dynamique-là. Je conclurai en remerciant tous les organisateurs et tous les participants à cette discussion. Je ne vais pas malheureusement pouvoir rester très longtemps, je vais devoir m'éclipser dans une demi-heure, et je cède la parole à Grégoire Mallard, entre les mains de qui vous allez rester. Donc Grégoire, professeur au département d'anthropologie et de sociologie de l'Institut et directeur de la recherche. Merci à vous tous.
Merci beaucoup Marie-Laure d'avoir introduit ce panel. I will be less eloquent and maybe a bit brief. It was a real pleasure to organize this panel with the co-panelists. The bios are on the website, so I will not take a lot of time. Daniel is an architect, is here with Augustin. They are actually managing at the same time almost the construction site that is going on in the Jardin right by our side, by our institute. Stéphane, who is online and will join us right after Daniel's talk to present the work of the Rimini Protocol, is a scenographer and has done a lot of work in theater, simulating, for instance, World Climate conferences with more than 600 participants. So these are the kind of challenges that the Rimini Protocol is mounting. And Anna Leander is the chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department, and she just had a very interesting interdisciplinary project funded on humanitarian design with designers from the ED. So this is the type of interdisciplinary conversation that we're thrilled to have. As Marie-Laure said, we are in the process of changing the space of centers, of our interdisciplinary research centers here at the Institute, co-constructing what is actually both a space and what is interdisciplinarity. And the two are very much intricately related, as we see in our day-to-day experiences. I would just add a word that it's for me also a special pleasure to organize this panel. It reminds me a visit I've made about 20 years ago in Karlsruhe when Bruno Latour started this pairing of social scientists with artists to create designs of public spaces, and I can only recommend. I think that it's a reference common to all of us, both Stéphane, Daniel, and Anna, when we discussed to organize the panel, making things public, which is the collected volume out of the Karlsruhe exhibition. For the anecdote, when I visited, the only artifact that didn't work was Bruno's artifact, the Phantom Public. But actually, this is very typical of how he used to work, showing the vulnerabilities of our episteme. And I think this panel is, in a sense, a tribute to his memory. I don't think we had any panel after he passed away. So maybe this is the one we can dedicate to his legacy. Thank you so much. Daniel, the floor is yours, and each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, after which we'll take questions from the room.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Can anyone? Okay, let's go. I will actually. In purpose, I didn't mention Latour in my. Because I thought it was very obvious, but you will see there are many other names that are his companion somehow. Thank you very much again for the invitation. I'm very glad, and yes, since the construction site is ongoing and there are a lot of things going on, I wrote my speech, so it'll be a bit more boring. Forgive me for that, but very happy to be here with hopefully not too many architects, because as you know, probably in your field is the same. We end up talking to the people that already know what we're talking about. So it's very interesting and stimulating. I put forward this very or quite ambitious title for this short presentation, probably not exactly knowing what to say about the vast universe of artificial intelligence. So it was a little bit spontaneous, and since AI is gaining some presence, quite a bit of it, I thought it was interesting to put it in parallel with what we're doing. So that it's the universe of AI is growing at a light speed, maybe at the risk of and I will sound a bit old here, but at the risk of overshadowing the more physical one, the physical world that we have lived in until recently. I have no particular issue or concern with digital or virtual processes myself, like body and mind extensions that makes us hybrids, cyborgs, in the words of Donna Haraway. On the contrary, that's part of, I believe that's part of what we are, quite fundamentally, parasite and parasite beings. Being myself a great admirer of David Cronenberg's work. But I do have a problem when the parasiting is imposed to us. When it comes to, from corporate worlds, which main goal, not to say the unique, is to produce wealth for a few. And obviously, in those cases, the parasite is injected into our own bodies without our consent. So I put up this little video for you that's a bit scary.
Jobs implementing what we're going to do with our time really matters. I agree that when we get to very powerful systems, the landscape will change. I think I'm just more optimistic that we are incredibly creative in finding things to do with better tools, and that will keep happening. My worst fears are that because if we leave the field of technology, the industry cause significant harm to the world, I think that can happen in a lot of ways. It's why we started the company. It's a bit like what I work today, in the past, able to spend some time with you. I think if this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong, and we want to be vocal about that. We want to work with the government to prevent that from happening, but we try to be very clear on it, about what the downside case is and the work that we have to do to mitigate that. Fears are that because and we fears are that a harm to the world, just because the world is not going to have a harm to the world. It's expensive with you. It's expensive to you. I would be expensive with you.
Funny and scary, right? The very clearly and worryingly displayed hypocrisy or cynicism of Mr. Samuel Altman at his allocution at the American Senate last Tuesday, the 16th of May, confirmed that the somewhat improvised title that I sent to Grégoire might make some sense in this context. I watched the film over and over with astonishment, wondering about the nature of what I was in front of. So his worst fears seem to be the same as our worst fears. Only there's quite a gap between his power to develop the artificial intelligence without facing any of the consequences of his worst fears and our impotence to face ours. Aside from the frustration of facing the impotence that our friend Franco Bifo Berardi has so well described in his essay Futurability. In front of this, we seem to be unable to do anything about it. Whether we swallow that farce in the Senate or not is up to our capacity to understand the global economic context and the influence of the tech within this very liberal landscape. At the opposite spectrum of Stéphane's collective practice, here in the video we assist to a one-man theatrical farce in a very Shakespearean way, where the Senate allows itself to physically become the stage of a perverse fiction. How we, as consumers and consumed public, can have access to the backstage of what's going on in the Senate? What are the public and political consequences of this exchange? And mostly, is there anything going really to happen in terms of regulatory issues? And if yes, in what time frame? Tech knows very well that speed is on its side. Shoshana Zuboff has perfectly described how the Silicon Valley runs and overruns the slow mechanism of state policies and their implementation. And finally, architecture, design, urban design, landscape design. probably the seemingly most distant field from what is shown in the film. But is it really? When talking about public space, aren't we also discussing any sort of public space? The space of the media, the digital one, and the physically lived and practiced. We, in Alice, work with and within tangible public spaces and the multiple actors that compose its complexity. Truck drivers, academic schedules, costs, transport, wood deliveries, like right now, state regulation, tools, tight times to construct, weather, presences, etc., etc. And we do all of this with the ambitious attempt to understand better how to make space public, as proposed by the title of the panel. These houses, gardens that we have been going on for some years now. And we have been doing them believing strongly that public space is one of the places where an important paradigm change is necessary and probable. Also a place where political mechanisms flagrantly see the light. Our attempt is simply to practice architecture, leaving as much as possible the consequences of our actions as architects and designers. Also, trusting that architecture is not a formal exercise which goal would be to create marketable objects, but that it's part of a collective endeavor. Architecture does not invent, but participates. And this attitude can also produce beauty, poetry. In public space, we understand that we have to walk towards what is understood as the commons, participating slightly off or outside institutional norms and regulations in order to activate valuable and durable situations. This is exactly what we are doing a few meters away from here, in the Parc Rigaud and in the gardens of the Red Cross Museum. Temporary works that could be temporary for quite a while. Ongoing works that might not see an end, that do not need to claim any objectual achievement, but are simply part of a long-term process of modification, observation, and activation. Crafted architectures, those considered minor, as defined by Jill Stoner, anti-monuments of power. Those where our bodies, individual and collective, are involved. Those that request collective reactions. Those where we can perceive, assume, live the consequences of our actions. Architectures built in time, where our drawings are tested in the field by ourselves. Those that try to bring to light the idea of commons. Those that can be redesigned continuously over time. Open architectures, open situations. Those contributing to transformations and be transformed. Built from bottom up, not too high. Those who are not visible. Those who attempt to reveal invisible situations. Those that can see the light outside the construction market, one of the great polluters of the world. Experiential attitudes, where we are now and where we have landed. Involved, including as much as possible. Feet and hands on the ground, but what ground? Who owns it? Does it need to be owned? Creating temporary communities to live on the building site, the building event. Shared spaces, but the word space seems to be too rooted in an architectural history that has produced many exclusions. I rather refer to situations than space. Situations include the presence of living beings interacting, parasiting one another. It is my deepest hope that the crafted architectures taking place nearby, mediated or facilitated by a group of pedagogues and architects, thought and constructed by hundreds of students, could also be heard at the Senate, and also be able to express our worst fears. but also propose our reactions, our capacities of participation that can enlarge the vision of a better present future. But maybe not. Maybe it's okay to keep the scale of our ambitions down, and maybe it's better to stick around these small and beautiful situations and keep on working with a few great people that allow these moments and projects to become investigative, practical, experimental, experiential, and collective. Thank you for your attention.
Stefan.
Hello. Yes, it seems I'm in your space now. Thank you for Daniel, and thank you for everybody to invite me to this. So I speak on behalf of my collective, Rimini Protokoll, which is based here in Berlin, but we regularly work also in Switzerland on the question, how can we deal with topics of our society and do actually spatialize them or turn them into sensual experiences? At the moment, you can, sometimes this happens in museums, sometimes in theaters, and for every Sunday until mid-June, it happens actually outside of Lausanne. Paysage Partagé is a project that I've invented together with Caroline Barneau, and it's dealing with topics of ecology, but it doesn't do it just on an academic level. It really does it in green spaces for a whole Sunday, every Sunday until 18th of June. But this is just one example. Today, I will focus on projects in which we work about diplomacy. So maybe we can jump a bit forward in, yes, next. Next would be the keyword to the technician to skip. Yeah, thank you. The World Economic Forum, based in Geneva, not far from you, but Davos is one of these places where we thought, why is it not a public space when the most wealthy companies of the world are present? Next. Historic moments have happened there, like Mr. Kohl and Mudrov have met. We thought it's an interesting place to situate ourselves inside Next. We decided then to build Next a space that, that is more immersive, that allows us to seat, in this case, 200 spectators in the position of 200 of those companies that are paying members of the World Economic Forum. They pay around 100,000 Swiss francs per year to be able to negotiate there about or improve the state of the world. That's a quote of the goal of the World Economic Forum. And we wondered, can we put spectators in a way in their positions? Next. So we created this round stage in Zurich Schauspielhaus and in some other theaters later, in which the audience actually impersonates a representative sample of those companies. Next. Here you see the audience seating opposed to each other, a bit in front of a backdrop of the Davos Mountains. Next. And after a while, they find under their seats a role that they will play during that evening. And it's a role of one of those about 5,000 top managers of top companies that they will impersonate somehow in the course of this performance. So we can run the video.
Gut, zeigen mir bitte Ihre Rolle. Ja, super. Den Namen. Ja, super. Sehr gut. Es gibt eine kurze Biografie auf Seite 3. Das ist die offizielle Biografie auf Ihre Rolle in Davos. Also, finden Sie heraus, wer Sie sind.
maybe turn down the volume a little bit as I keep speaking over it. So the people that you might, for instance, be here, the chairman of chief executive officer of Tata Steel Company, one of the biggest steel producers in the world. So you will step in their role because we kind of broke down the demography of who is up there in Davos during the event every January. And that allows us to put in a relation who is actually up there. Maybe we jump to the next film. Yes.
Und wer ist deine Frau? Sehen Sie, letztes Jahr waren alle Frauen zusammen nur 12,5% der globalen Wirtschaftselite in Davos. Leider ist das die Realität auf den alle Chefetagen rund um die Welt. Die Mehrheit von ihnen sind white, middle-aged straight men. Dagegen kämpfe ich. Auf Seite 7 gibt es eine kurze Zitat von sich selbst.
Maybe you can jump.
On the same page, you also...
So, yeah. So you basically understand when you're part of this, how it's composed, the community that is supposedly on our behalf saving the world.
Rot, die vielen Nordamerikaner. Schwarz heißt, sie sind aus Asien. Und wo ist Gelb? Gelb, bitte Hände hoch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Also sie sind die 6 Vertreter aus Afrika. Und Grün ist aus Südamerika. Ja, einige aus Südamerika. Und Hellblau ist Ozeanien. Sie sind aus Australien. Also, wenn Sie den Zustand der Welt verbessern wollen und so etwas wie die Weltregierung sein wollen, dann ist die Welt hier sehr schlecht vertreten. In der UNO sieht es anders aus. Jetzt gehen wir in die UNO. Also, wissen Sie, was das ist? Das ist die General Assembly Hall in New York. Also bitte drehen Sie das Buch um und zeigen Sie mir eine Fahne. Ja, schön. Zeigen Sie mal die Fahnen. Wir haben jedem von Ihnen die Fahne eines Landes aus der UNO zugeteilt. Das Land hat mit Ihrer Firma gar nichts zu tun. Sie sitzen einfach in alphabetischer Ordnung, wie in der UNO. Aber jetzt werden wir die Gegenprobe machen. Wer von Ihnen ist aus Afrika? Afrika, Hände hoch. Es gibt 54 Länder aus Afrika gegen 48 aus Europa.
Okay, can we skip? Okay, so yeah, basically you see the experience that we transmit to the audience in this room that is a bit working as a big parliamentary session as we're facing each other in this room is that, representation happens on a very different and maybe more justified level, obviously, in the United Nations, whereas the World Economic Forum may have more power gathered together, but is not really in accordance to the democratic values, which brings, we're not idealizing the United Nations. We all know that the Sustainable Development Goals have problems in being incorporated because things are not just voted by majorities. Things can be very slow, but I guess that's all the complexity of this is something that unfolds within this performance that takes about 2 hours. Maybe I jump to the second example of a project where we were using diplomatic stages somehow for a very different different topic. In this case, it was the, maybe we can skip forward, the United World Conference on Climate Change, the COP that happens, as most of you will know, every December in a different country. It's just in Egypt last year. This was in 2014, so it was just a year before the Paris Agreement was signed. And in Schauspielhaus Hamburg, which is the biggest German speaking theater place, we installed a lot of little flags. And when you came to see the show, maybe we can start the video, you would step into the role of a delegation. Maybe you can turn down the volume a little bit so I can speak over it. Thank you. Yeah, so 196 delegations, and when you came into the room, you randomly were attributed to either the Saudi Arabian delegation or the Swiss or the Sudanese delegation. You received a little booklet that allows you to understand what are actually what's the democratic situation in the country that you might not even have heard its name before.
Verehrte Delegation, herzlich willkommen zur Weltklimakonferenz 2014. Sie sind nicht hier als normaler Hamburger Zuschauer in einem Theaterstück, sondern Sie sind heute Teil von 196 Delegationen in dieser Weltklimakonferenz. Die erste COP war 95 in Berlin bei den Kollegen aus Deutschland. Wo sind die heute Abend? Da hinten, vielen Dank. Deutschland war grundsätzlich sehr aktiv in der Klimaverhandlung, hat eben damals auch die erste COP nicht weit von hier in Berlin ausgerichtet. Wir stehen vor der Herausforderung, mit allen Delegationen hier im Saal eine Lösung zu erzielen. Und die Weltgemeinschaft hat sich geeinigt, mehr als 2 Grad ist gefährlich. Wenn wir weiter wachsen, mehr Menschen werden, mehr Technik haben, mehr Energie brauchen, dann sehen wir, dass wir einfach immer weiter pro Jahr mehr Tonnen CO2 emittieren werden. Wir sehen gleichzeitig so einen blauen Schlauch. Das ist das, was die Wissenschaft gesagt hat, was kompatibel wäre mit einer Erwärmung der Welt, die nicht über 2 Grad hinausgeht. Das geht so nicht mit Business as usual. Das heißt, es geht forward. Das bringt uns.
Okay, so basically the topics that every delegation during this, a real COP obviously takes 3 weeks. We had only 4 hours for this performance, but the decisions that each delegation would have to take on behalf of their country that they incorporate that night is actually the 3 questions that were on the table before Paris. How much increase or decrease the CO2 output until 2020 back then, until 2050, and how much money do you give in the Green Climate Fund to mend some of the problems? Those decisions would have to be taken by the audience, but we didn't want them to naively decide as themselves, because obviously everybody wants to save the planet, but not everybody has the mandate to do so by the people they got elected into their governments for. And so maybe we tried to complexify to show the complexity of the picture as it is displayed for the politicians that do represent their countries in those COPs. And we did this again in a very spatial situation, because it just starts on the big stage. We can run the video.
Dann haben Sie auch einen Zeitplan auf der ersten Seite. Das ist die Agenda. Wir zeigen ihn auch mal wieder für Belgien. Da müssen Sie heute Abend sehr oft drauf gucken und da müssen Sie sich sehr genau dran halten. Wir haben nicht nur den Raum hier, sondern wir tagen in 7 Räumen gleichzeitig den Rest des Abends. Wir sind jetzt gerade hier am Anfang im Saal, dann gibt es 3 Blöcke und dann sind wir am Ende nochmal wieder hier im Saal. Aber deswegen, wo Sie zu einer bestimmten Zeit zu sein haben, das sehen Sie in Ihrem Plan. Da müssen Sie bitte wirklich darauf achten und versuchen, sich dran zu halten. Die Zeiten, die da draufstehen, werden exakt eingehalten. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, verehrte Delegationen, ich wünsche Ihnen und uns allen viel Erfolg in den nächsten Stunden. Hiermit erkläre ich die Weltklimakonferenz 2014 für eröffnet.
So basically people start moving, start walking through different spaces, 8 different places they go to, one of them is in the restaurant, one is even inside a bus, and they are mixed together in delegations according to certain topics. We had experts from the climate university that are quite strong in Hamburg, that provided us with some people that talk about the very specific problems. So people would gather in smaller meetings for 20 minutes where it was all about El Nino, or all about desertification, or all about melting glaciers, according to the country, and to the countries, or together with the countries that have the same problems. Or in another next 20 minutes session, they would learn from politicians actually that have been going to the COP about problems that are that unite countries of the European Union, which normally in these conferences have to take decisions together. So maybe we can skip to the next video. So here we jump into the Middle East session.
Gefühlt, sondern wegen des Wassers.
Добрий вечір, товариші. Я приветствую вас в группе Восточной Европы. Ich gehe doch mal davon aus, dass Sie alle Russisch sprechen. Ich begrüße Sie in der Briefinggruppe aus Europa. Und da ist natürlich Russland ein ganz dominierendes Land. Und zwar wird Russland relativ stark betroffen sein vom Klimawandel. Aber in erster Linie wohl, so gehen Sie zumindest davon aus, positiv. Aktuell ist es gerade so, dass Russland seine Machtstellung doch wieder weiter versucht auszubauen. Also ich meine,
Okay, that has developed further. We can maybe skip to the next video. Here we see actually the European groups listening while the African groups are rotating on the ground.
Vielleicht stehen Sie einfach mal auf als Gewinner sozusagen des Klimawandels. Wo ist Norwegen? Herzlichen Glückwunsch. Es ist auch schön, dass Sie andere Einnahmequellen sozusagen an Land ziehen, Tourismus, Landwirtschaft, wenn Ihre Ölvorräte so langsam zur Neige gehen. Schweden, Ostseeöl.
In Afrika, Heiland.
So the African delegation hear the sound through a headphone, and it's a Nigerian representative of the African Union actually that is briefing them into what their goal in such a climate conference may be. So after all these briefing sessions, we jump forward in the next video. We come to the decisions, because after 2.5 hours, the delegations had to fill out the papers, and then we calculated through a computer what all these results would mean. Run the video, please.
Das war es jetzt tatsächlich von den Experten. Jetzt geht es nur noch um das, was Sie geleistet haben. Welche Länder wollen denn am meisten reduzieren bis 2020?
Am meisten reduzieren bis 2020 wollte Bolivien mit 65%.
Ja, vielen Dank. Das ist ein ambitioniertes Reduktionsziel, wenn man mal davon ausgeht, dass da jetzt ja nur noch 6 Jahre Zeit für sind. Aber wir wünschen den Kollegen in Bolivien natürlich sehr viel Erfolg dabei. Die Frage ist, wenn wir jetzt alle Zahlen zusammentun, wir haben ganz am Anfang diesen Graphen gesehen, Business as usual und diesen 2-Grad-Schlauch. Würde das denn reichen für 2020?
Also wir sind jetzt ungefähr hier. Und da würde man jetzt diesen Startpunkt von dem Graph ansetzen. Und es ist jetzt für 2020, haben wir es tatsächlich geschafft. Da sind wir bei etwas über 40.
Das sieht sehr gut aus, vielen Dank. Die Frage ist 2050. Das ist die größere Frage. Wie wollen wir langfristig die Weltgesellschaft umstellen? Wer hat denn für 2050 am meisten versprochen?
Ja, da haben wir gleich 5 Länder, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, die versprochen haben, 100% zu reduzieren. Und Kolumbien, Mauritius und Niue, Kiribati und die Niederlande.
Okay, maybe we can turn down the volume a bit, or maybe jump to the next picture. So some of these results may be a bit naive for single countries, but actually on the whole, every night had different results. On the whole, the results were not so far from what 1 year later in Paris was decided. By the way, Bruno too was mentioned in the beginning. It's funny that actually half a year after our World Climate Conference, he organized in Théâtre des Amandiers in Nanterre, also a kind of a simulation with the students of Sciences Po. But obviously they were all experts, people that were already busy with climate change topics, with politics. In our case, there were 20 shows of 600 people, and these were just normal theater audiences. So that's kind of where we come from. People think they buy a ticket for a theater project, but kind of get immersed into, and in the end, political situation that is a situation about representation, I guess, as well, which in the end is also is as much a democratic question as it is a theater question. I think I'll end here. I hope some of this was audible in your space. A bit disconnected.
Let's see here. Can I turn? Can you hear me in this? Yes. Okay, super. So it's a pleasure to have Daniel and Stefan come here and to have Grégoire organize something along these lines at the Institute and opening actually space for this kind of work. And what I want to do now, and I'm going to try to do it relatively briefly so that we actually have a little bit of time for discussion. I want to talk about a project that we're starting. So unlike Stefan and Daniel, it's not a project that we've finished. We're starting officially in September, and we're right now hiring people. So I don't have pictures from it for a good reason. I could have brought you the beautiful tables and figures that we placed in the application number 16 that we had to write to get the project, but I didn't do that. So I'm just going to basically say a little bit about what we're doing in that project in the Institute. And I'm, again, super grateful for this event and having a chance to air this egoistically, hoping to get some nice reactions on the idea. So I'll try to be as clear and as political sciencey as I possibly can, and hope that some of this comes across. As Grégoire said when he did his introduction, the project is about it's called The Future of Humanitarian Design. And it's basically about how we can use design and think about designing of spaces to prevent violence. So it's a violence prevention project. And what I want to say is, and the basic idea is basically, when Marie-Laure was talking before, our director, she talked about the nudging, structural nudging. So the idea is to use what we know about effects and aesthetics and think about how we might more effectively actually work with that to prevent violence in humanitarian settings. And I want to say three things about it. First, I wanted to contextualize a little bit to this, the theme of today, because in the sort of context of a panel discussion, that's probably helpful. And then briefly say something about what we're actually planning to do, and then say very microscopically something about how we're planning to do that. And when I say we, just to start off, it's quite a big team. We've been very lucky. And of course, there's the material foundations of research that we all know too much about. So we got generous support from the SNSF. And so we're doing it with the head of the Department of Interior Architecture at the head of the School of Art and Design here in Geneva, in collaboration with the EPFL. So the Polytechnic of Lausanne, where we're working with a lab that also has a memorandum of agreement with the Institute and does a lot of work for the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations. They basically function as a hub inside the EPFL for various tech projects in humanitarian setting. They're called Essential Tech. And my colleague Jonathan Austin, who's at the University of Copenhagen. And then we have, in addition to this, we have a bunch of PhD researchers. We had the possibility to hire 3 PhD researchers that will be working on their own projects, and 3 postdocs, a senior researcher, a coordinator, and we're working with organizations locally. And locally in this context means in the Kivus, where we've set up with a research institute, and in Colombia, in Naruac on the Venezuelan border, where we'll be working with organizations that are based there. So very briefly, first contextualizing to the idea of making public, Latour's phrase indeed, and diplomatic space. So in this project, we're taking a route which is really about looking at the mundane technologies that are important in a humanitarian setting. And so it's bringing in, to use another Latour phrase, the missing masses into the idea of how we actually work to prevent violence. So we're making public basically the participation of artifacts in the making of violence, and therefore also in the prevention of violence. And that's where the designing of these artifacts becomes very important. So making public. Making diplomatic space. So we're interested in the spaces where violence is actually negotiated and therefore also prevented, which, thank you, Stefan. It's also, of course, very important what goes on in the UN and the UN rooms in the public spaces that Danielle is working with. But it's also very important what goes on in a very quotidian and banal way in humanitarian context in the kinds of sites that we'll be working with. So that's what it's a diplomatic space of a different kind. And I'm a professor of international relations and political science, and I find it really actually interesting that I'm the one who's interested in that kind of space primarily, where I see Stefan doing something that has a lot in common with the Model UN kind of initiatives that we have. And so we can talk more about this. But anyway, the idea of sort of decentering away from high politics down to the mundane, quotidian kinds of politics. So that's the contextualization, making diplomatic space and making public. Now, what are we actually planning to do? And this is banalizing very grossly, of course. We're planning to do 3 things. One is to make prototypes of 3 kinds of technologies in 3 milieus. So let me just say that, and that's why we're working with the EPFL and with the design school. So the 3 technologies that we're focusing on is a violent prevention algorithm for detention, so to prevent torture, so violence against people in detention. The second one is working with lighting systems inside the camp, so working with the space and the light specifically in the camp. And then we're working with the integrated communication systems around humanitarian workers. And so the idea with the lightning system is to prevent gender-based violence, work with the prevention of gender-based violence, and around the compounds where humanitarian live, it's about the prevention of violence against humanitarian workers, but also the violence that the efforts to prevent violence against humanitarian workers cause. So that's the first thing. These 3, the aim is at the end of the project to arrive at 3 kinds of technologies, prototypes of technologies. Then we have very ambitious theoretical aims. So for knowledge to stick and for this kind of work, so if we're thinking that working with affect and design, working interdisciplinary and so on, for that to take anchor and take root and live on beyond the project, we need to lay the basis, the foundation, theoretically and pedagogically for that to last, to live on, so to speak, beyond this project that we've been lucky to get funding for and so on, and I'm sure we'll all enjoy doing. And so we actually we're starting already to plan teaching across the Graduate Institute and HED, setting that up. We're planning, I already managed to persuade a publisher that this was a brilliant idea, and they absolutely wanted to publish our co-authored textbook on how to do these kinds of things and so on. So we're taking the knowledge part and the theory part of this very seriously. And thinking about doing it in collaboration. And that brings me to the third thing. So a very important part, the way we see this, is a reflexive exercise. So basically bending back on the process itself and thinking sociologically, politically, about what it means to work interdisciplinarily and transvocationally, so across professions, across when I say disciplines, I don't know if we should call the humanities a discipline or, if interior architecture is that, but never mind, let's not get into that. Anyway, working across the usual boundaries of knowledge and types of knowledge that we have, and working across the professions. We also have a number of aims that are connected. And I should say, really sorry for not placing this earlier, also working across context. So obviously working in the Kivus and in Arhuaca in Colombia is very different context than Geneva. And we're actually taking the field work bit of this quite seriously. So that's the three things we're aiming to do: the prototyping, the academic side, the pedagogical side, how to make knowledge live, and a sort of more practical, process-oriented thing, how to make this continue beyond. And then I was going to say something very briefly about how. Maybe that's just going to get us. Maybe I should just skip that and say. So we'll have to. I was going to talk a little bit about the specific approach we have, which we term a material aesthetic, participatory, socio-ecologically anchored approach, but I think that's going to take us. It's going to take me too long to explain. So there's just no. But we have we've developed an approach and have all kinds of reasons for wanting to follow that approach that I could talk forever about, and I would bore you to death. So please stop me. And we've devised, again, a very Latourian, Latour is a theme here, but it's a common reference point, so maybe that's not so bad. We call it a box-to-box methodology, basically the steps of the methodology that we plan to work along with. And very important, it's a deeply collective project. So the whole idea is that the reason that we're working with the EPFL, with the Essential Tech people, and with Javier Contreras, he has a name, of course, and so the Solomsi at the EPFL. So the reason we're working with them is, of course, that they see different things than we do. So we actually plan to do this work collectively in all the steps, and the very central part of the project are co-design workshops where we'll also engage beyond ourselves. So of course there's a core team. Academic practice is a very specific practice. It takes a lot of training and a lot of, I don't know if it's good or bad, but that's what we do. So anyway, so we're doing, that part is certainly us, but we're also extending beyond this in the context where we're planning to work. So I think this is where I should stop. I shouldn't take more of your patience. And again, thank you very much, especially to Grégoire, our head of research. I'm so happy I'm here with a vague support for this kind of thing, because it's not self-evident. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move to the discussion. I may start with a few comments, and then we open the discussion to the room. My first comment actually piggybacks on what Anna said about how some of the designs are reminiscent of our pedagogy sometimes in international studies education. Whether it's executive education, I remember when I was running an international negotiation and policy program for diplomats, we had trainers teach to our participants how you do elevator talk. you take the elevator with the minister, you have 2 minutes within the elevator to convince him to represent your position in a negotiation. Similar things, I was running in one of my classes with Marc Finot, a trained diplomat, a French diplomat of nuclear non-proliferation. Our students were modeling NPT REFCON negotiation. And this is quite typical. We know of the simulations that the National Security Council in the US are running. What happens if a nuclear weapon falls in the Taliban's hand? That was the 2003, 2002 topics of the time. What happens if there's a nuclear device exploding in New York? And you run a simulation of National Security Council meeting. So here the issue is to train skills, and always in our reflections as scholars and teachers is the question of where is the critical position where is the critical edge when we do that, because when our public are students, of course they come here to become diplomats, but when the public is a public, so an unspecified group of citizens, does this change? Does it make it automatically critical to teach outside the university? Or do you define the critical edge somehow specifically? That would be something that I would be very interested in if you could locate the critical somewhere. And there, in a sense, hearing Stéphane makes me remember actually one of the videos in the Karlsruhe exhibition that I remember was very puzzling, was the moment where a communist parade unfolds and becomes a democratic upsurge. And there was an art historian looking at what is the aesthetic of a communist parade. Everybody has its flag and waves at the leader together, and suddenly something happens and contingency erupts. And I was wondering, where is the role of contingency in the plays of Stéphane, or where is the role of contingency and unplannedness in the sort of designs that you are building, Daniel, in your work? And is contingency the visible element or the disruption of order, the visible element that something democratic happens? So these are the two reflections I had about the question of how to develop a critical thinking in today's time. The second line of thought, and feel free, to maybe address each one of the two independently or just one, is the question of how do we change the world, in a sense, and how do we get listened to by the Senate, in a sense. You mentioned this concern that it's all good to create these concrete utopias, these places that multiply the opportunities for the public to coalesce and to gather around critical opinions and expressions of will. But how do we build also the link with the legitimate and existing institutions of representation? And in a sense, we could say that some of the experiments that you have been running, like, for instance, this COP simulation, in a sense, remind me of this new instrument, which is the citizen conferences. In a sense, for instance, the French president, Macron, he had put together that type of citizen simulation by saying we're going to select a group of 300 citizens, have them trained, do the negotiation about what should be done for the law to change in order to meet our goals in terms of carbon emission reductions. And that was, there was this great hope that maybe the report would make it into law, and that was the promise upon which the participation was made, and eventually, as soon as the report arrived, it was gutted and everything was reduced to almost zero, and the report was put into a drawer somewhere. And so there's always the risk that, in a sense, these simulations become subverted by power itself, and that these techniques are reappropriated by power and change from their original objective. And I was wondering how you prevent that from happening. So on these two lines of comments, maybe I give you the floor to react, and feel free to, move beyond the framework I imposed and start, discussing across the panel, and I'll give you the 3 minutes each to comment on whatever you have heard that you find interesting. Daniel first, and then Stefan.
I can go on the critical thinking side. I think there's one fundamental thing about pedagogy. We talk just about that, or is that at the speed of how things are going, I don't think we need to teach anything. Because whatever we're teaching is to the young people to be different than we have been. So what can we teach? We have no experience, of a world that we don't know about. So I think that's very fundamental, because that means that we should fundamentally again change our role as pedagogues somehow. So maybe to echo what you were saying, I think that in our case, simulation would not be the word. I mean, clearly not. We're not trying to isolate the students in a situation where they are protected to do something under a bubble. I think, yes, there is the institution, and we have to be clear about. We are within the EPFL, and being within the EPFL allows us to be a little bit wild, but within a very, very privileged context, obviously. In Switzerland, with a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of means and resources, but there's no such thing as simulations. It's just putting ourselves with the students in these situations where we have to act and react and observe and talk to people and talk about wood and talk about bolts and these things that are very very simple actually. So it's kind of like a very it might sound like very conceptual somehow, but at the end of the day, it's very practical. So the idea there, I mean, and when we started this program of houses, gardens, and while observing what was going on the chantier, on the construction side, we're like, if this goes on, we ruin IKEA, because I mean, at one point the students are so spontaneous, or we are so spontaneous that you can make a chair just like this. It doesn't take so much time when the collective is so powerful. So you feel this with 200 students, which is a lot and not so much. So when you see that you can do this shortcutting pretty much all of the market solutions, really all of them. I mean, it's just, and especially now, wood actually comes from the state of Geneva, that they don't know what to do with it. So there's a whole cycle of materials as well. We use, we storage it, we maintain the structure. So, I mean, it is kind of like a concrete utopia, and I think that institution, and this we have to say again, it allows us to do, which is not nothing, it's a lot. But if that produces the same inertia outside the institution, then I think, then these guys will be other types of architects than what I have been. So in the critical thinking, I would say, that maybe what it's to redefine by the pedagogy time or the schedule of the time that we are with the students, it's what is to be an architect or what is to be a diplomat, and which kind of institution do you want to work with, or which kind of institution do you want to mount? Because maybe the ones, the 2-minute elevator, I would be extremely critical about it, because that's just to respond to a system that exists already and that gives you 2 minutes to talk with the president. I don't want 2 minutes. I want 2 hours with the president, and maybe 2 days. and that's what it takes to maybe do diplomacy. I don't know much about diplomacy, but I mean, I think that's the kind of thinking. And when I was in my kind of manifesto text talking about insisting on Isabel Stenger's consequence of your actions, I think that's basically what we're trying to do with the student. It's like, what you think, what you draw, it's not a conceptual folly. It's something that you have to build, and then you see how it happens. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Stefan?
Yeah, contingency maybe. I can imagine that the setups of Daniel, and I guess in the future also the ones of Anna, they will have, as they are happening in I don't know if a camp is a public space, but definitely the spaces that Daniel's students are bricolaging around in this moment. They will have contingent audiences that you might not meet inside the institution. The two examples, and the same thing happens to us when these days we are in the Plaine de Mauvernay above Lausanne doing paysage partagé, because we're totally exposed to weather, to all the users of the forest areas that coincide with our performances. In the two examples that I've shown, it's a bit different because it's happening within theater spaces, but by dissolving the spatial situation, we create the option of the users or spectators. I never really know how to call them in these participatory setups, how they can take over control or influence control, because obviously they identify another spectator that is now standing for Australia, one of the monsters in the climate change debate, and will confront him, her, the group with a process that happens. So there is something as a bit of a social plastique, I guess, to these things that has a life of its own that goes beyond my control as a theater director. I'm actually more theater director than a scenographer. In terms of critics, I think, yes, we're certainly installing a lot of reflection about the institutions we depict with our simulations. But I also feel that we are in a situation in the moment where out in society there seems to be the post-democratic virus so deeply inserted that I sometimes even feel that it's not so bad also to create an awareness of the pros of representative setups of democracy. So it's not only about deconstructing that kind of mechanisms. It's about showing their complexity and then very specific where there is critique important to do it, but it's not just coming from an anarchistic point of view, saying these, which unfortunately in much of the reports about COPs, in much of the reports about Davos, there would be a very clear and simplifying slogan often that then is in the end all that communicates to the users. Citizen conferences, I like those concepts very much, I must say. There have been definitely some of them, maybe the French example you give is a bit a sad one, I do agree. If you look at the Irish example, where they had 100 citizens working together over the course of a half a year about the abortion question, I think you had a more sustainable impact on the entire society, which actually had a positive impact in the end on the policy coming out of it. But that's, in any way, we're not kind of directly in danger of being, because we're not run by a government. We are in this kind of space somewhere where what is theater? It's somewhere between, I guess, entertainment and reflection, and so what we can is we can open minds of people, but we won't replace the parliaments.
Thank you so much, Stefan.
Sorry, this is still working, right? Okay, so it's nice to have a research director that asks you to change the world, nothing less. And by now I have 1,000 things to say about what you said, but I'll just answer very briefly on my own behalf how we see the changing the world and where's critique bit. And they go together. So very briefly, if we think classically, Honnet, critical tradition, social sciences, critique being about moving the boundaries of what we know. I think this is very much what we're into in the project. It's very much about actually shifting practices at all kinds of levels. And so create, thanks for bringing Haraway into the room earlier, Daniel, responsibility, the ability to respond to violence, to work with that and change the way we think about it. So it's a sort of deeply actually ambitious in that sense project. I don't say work, but that's certainly the articulated ambition. And to anchor it, and that has something to do with the question about how you make things live on beyond the project, to anchor it in knowledge practices and to do so. And again, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate the emphasis. So you said, what can we possibly teach? So the emphasis on process, on this not becoming stuck. And one of my, a political theorist, if you like, Jack Halberstam, queer theory about, refusing aesthetics of bewilderment, the politics of bewilderment, refusing to become stuck in one place, refusing the boxes of, being squared in. So this is very much indeed the spirit of what we're trying to do, basically, trying to anchor it into processes where it can continue to live on, and therefore contingency, take on also the unexpected. And I'd say very strongly in terms of politics, the idea of contingency and the idea of the unexpected is actually part of what we see in the positive. And of course, you brought in Stengers, but Vincent Desprez, this whole tradition of thinking, where indeed friction and friction with things that you don't already know are a part and parcel of what you think about in the positive as ways of moving boundaries. So the idea isn't, we decide the future here and forever after, and we know everything, and then we've settled it. But the idea is more to anchor ways of thinking and practical processes around those, and also reflect on the reasons why it's so difficult. Of course, when we wrote this project, of course, there's heap loads of people who've tried to do similar things and so on. So we're not at all the first. And I also think a lot of things have changed. The fact that we actually do have this panel here today, thank you, Grégoire, I think is a sign of this. So it's not a fixed thing. But so very briefly, just to sort of summarize up on that. So working with responsibility as a form, responsibility as a form of critique, working with processes, so Halberstam and so on, and working with frictions. That's the sort of three, very briefly, answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, questions from the room? Yes.
No mic?
I
mean, I can speak up, but I don't know if Stefan would hear me.
Stefan, can you hear?
Can you hear me, Stefan?
Yes, actually I can, yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm Cécile Molinier. I worked with Salut, and you actually saw me on the screen in Weltzustand Davos when I was addressing the audience, and it was a wonderful experience. But my question would be for you, Anna. I know it's work in progress, you don't want to bore us with your approach, but I'm very much interested in hearing to what extent is the interaction with the people on the ground bringing about a change in the understanding that you and your students might have had originally of a humanitarian space and of a space where negotiations can take place. Thank you.
Maybe we take a second question. I saw Julie, you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's really exciting to have this panel here today. I am an associate professor of anthropology here at the Graduate Institute, and therefore my questions are more directed to Stefan and Daniel, because Anna, I know your work a bit more. And I'm kind of interested in knowing a little bit more about what these installations or simulations have taught you about space that could help us rethink the way spaces work. I'm asking these questions because I'm also an anthropologist of institutions, and I've kind of observed many of these UN meetings. And so I've been kind of puzzled by the ways in which the organization of space and of time also constrains what can be said, how it can be said, how people can participate, and so on and so forth. And so I guess what you're trying to do, especially you, Daniel, through these kind of crafted architectures, situations, is to try and think about different ways of organizing space that can open up, new kinds of conversation, create new commons, new publics, and so on and so forth. And I guess in your work, Stefan, what you're trying to perhaps do with the Rimini Protocol is also to try and see how dissent can be perhaps leveraged in unexpected ways in these spaces that are so formal and so structured. So my question is, what did you learn from these experiments that could help us rethink the place of space, not only in diplomacy, but I'm also thinking in teaching, with our own students, with the way we think about how knowledge should be created and transmitted and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So everybody has a question. So maybe we'll start in reverse order with Anna and then Stefan and Daniel.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And of course, it's a very complicated one because we all know, I think, in this room that it's very difficult to actually organize participatory events across contexts that are very different. It's always complicated because there are always power relations, and I forgot to get back on Grégoire's question about power, but I'll conclude on that. But so we're very much aware of the many let's put it like this, difficulties that exist actually in creating genuine forms of participation where you can actually hear what people have to say. Because of the way we approach the world, we see selectively and so on. By necessity, we all see from somewhere and we all engage from somewhere. So although I said when I was talking about this, we're planning to do this in a very participatory manner. We take the fieldwork very seriously. Of course, having said that, that's of course not such an easy thing. So what have we done about this concretely? Like what are we therefore doing about this? So we're working, I mentioned very briefly the local organism. So basically, there are layers of trying to, you can't really get away from the issues it poses in terms of how we know and what we can know, but you can work with it, like acknowledging it and work with it. So we're working with research institutes in Colombia and in the DRC that are sort of a step closer to us and will participate in the co-design bit of this. We're working with humanitarian organizations, and actually the essential tech has been very important, but also earlier fieldwork experience that we've had in the context. And then when the idea is to do the fieldwork part of this, so collectively, so that we see collectively, because if the core idea is to bring in the material, we really need both the designer and the engineers to come with us and actually do this. But then so we're sort of having an observation phase, and then a phase where we're actually engaging not only the researchers at the various level and the organizations, the practitioners, but also actually the people that we're intending to prevent violence. And I wouldn't say for, because actually at that stage it becomes with. So that's a little bit of a long-winded answer, and I think it's not a perfect one because it is a very complicated issue to deal with, but it's how we're going about it. Thank you very much.
Stefan.
Spaces, well, I mean, we come from theater, and the classic theater space is one where the audience comes together, sometimes from far away, and then you sit down somewhere, and then the lights are switched off so that you don't see each other anymore. But you basically meant to admire the people that are in the light. And I guess that's the first thing that is important, to dissolve this frontality and turn it into something where everybody is in the light. That, I guess, is a simple rule of participatory actions. And then I think what sometimes maybe diplomatic circuits could learn, or are, I guess, learning already, is from theater, is the as if principle, the playfulness where you're kind of setting yourself in, trying to step into the role of somebody else. And we often do mix up these role games also, because we're often not working with actors. I'm thrilled to hear that Cécile Molinier is somewhere in the audience right now. So she's been working with the United Nations. You saw her on the screen. So she's an expert that, when I called her, can we do theater together? It, I guess, was a bit of a surprise to her. And then we take these experts into something that makes them a bit step down from maybe a very high political precision or academic knowledge. Also, in the case of the climate change experts that we worked with in Hamburg, takes quite some diplomacy to convince those to enter a game where actually we don't have 2 days and not even 2 hours to talk with a politician or in the role of a politician, but where we do have to time ourselves maybe to 2 minutes and still transmit something, even in a simplified way, but that gives you a picture of the bigger complexity.
Yep. What we have learned, many things, or so much. Maybe it would be interesting to do a list of very, very practical things that we have learned, which is so nice. But one of the things that we have learned, for instance, as pedagogues, is that transfer knowledge does not work so well. But know-how transfer, that works very well. And this is very Richardson, the whole idea of craftsman and artisanship. So things that you can actually learn to teach very tangibly. Those are things that can be improved. Transfer knowledge, I think it's now not so interesting, because most of the young people can get the knowledge from somewhere else than from you. So on the pedagogy side, I think that we have learned a lot from that. Of course, we have learned to make mistakes and to know that that's okay. And it's very interesting, the collaboration that we have had with Pascal, where we have actually done many things that probably he doesn't use at all. They're not so interesting. But, that's the kind of like the contract that we have. It's like, okay, let's play around and let's see what happens. So that's very interesting. And what we have learned as well in being more and more public, actually, because we started in campus when we did the very first house. We call them houses and now gardens. It was in campus. And then we went out of campus just to confront ourselves and we've become more and more public. And actually what we do and what stays is not seen or judged even or experienced as a pedagogy. It's seen and experienced as any public space by people. So that's also interesting this is something that we have learned, is that putting the good amount and the good people together, again, this idea of 150 people working together with some common ground under an institution with some direction. Let's say if 10 schools were doing this around Geneva would not look as it does today. The urban landscape of Geneva would be extremely different. And this is the things that we cannot even think about, no? If you think about the institutions that govern us as they do. And actually, what is also one thing that we're learning, and this is what's happening actually in Parc Rigaud and in another way in the Red Cross Museum, is that sometimes you can bypass the regulations, because in this case Pascal, in the other case in Parc Rigaud is Tiffaine Bussy, who's a project leader. So actually, hierarchically, she's really not that high, let's say, at the government level, but she's really making everything possible so we don't have to face regulations as any other type of normal project would have to. And that's her role. And, we had a lot of friction last week because there were problems, as usual. And, she shields us, basically. She says, don't worry, just do your work. I will take care of the TPG, I will take care of this, So that's an incredible thing that we have learned is that, when it happens and you find the right people, it's incredibly powerful because, again, the city would not really drastically would not look like this if this was done all over. And then, I will give an example of very practical things that we have learned. There are a lot of logs left in the Geneva canton. Actually, the logs, when they cut them, for many reasons, many of them are not suited for the market because they might have, the wrong diameter when they cut them with the normal machines. They're not performant, actually, the logs. So usually they end up in firewood. But these logs are beautiful. It's like oak trees and, things that if you were to buy them, they would be extremely expensive. So every year we get like 5 to 6 cubic meters from the state, and they give us this wood. And then we actually have an ex-architect, someone who studied architect, but decided to do otherwise, to live otherwise. And he works like a lumber, and he bought himself a mobile sawmill. So he actually takes these logs and then cuts them for us, and the whole cycle is... and we have had this collaboration with the Canton of Geneva for now 4 years, and it's, again, fantastic. So there are dozens of things like this that we actually learned, like very, very practical. So I think that if we keep on going, and now the process that we are into now is a process where we come back, and this is what we're doing at the Museum of the Red Cross, is we come back to the site and we say, what did we do wrong with the help of our partners? What did we do right? How can we improve? And we both are critical. Not only Pascal is critical and sets the brief. We are critical as well with our own work, and then we kind of like, take care of it, clean it up, extend it, make it better. And this is also a very interesting thing for an architect because, architects don't think that they're going to spend their time renovating things, usually. But this is something that is changing as well.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Perhaps a question about the future of architecture and the way. I am Alan Rank. I am the co-founder of the Open Urbanism Foundation, and I'm interested in what do you think about how you can increase your impact by sharing what you do as a common, for example, and not to stay as the author, like architect. So how you can perhaps you say Geneva could be very different if they have a lot of projects inspiring by your work. How you can make this and empower people, state, you or other architects that share your way you work.
No authorship on my side for sure. This is something that has been running in many other schools as well, differently maybe, but there's nothing original about it. I could send you back. Maybe you know this book and research, but maybe it's interesting for all of you. It's a book that is called Radical Pedagogies, written by Beatriz Colomina, who's a researcher and an architect in Colombia. And she's traced and archived what she has called radical pedagogies. And she actually starts the book saying, and this is also referring to what you were saying, because you said a few times anchoring, and actually she presents the word radical coming from root, which is an interesting thing as well. Radical does not mean unrooted and nomad ideas. And there you can see that from the, let's say, 40s, 50s to the, let's say, late 70s, there has been a great number of experimentation or experimental pedagogies all over the world, really, and she archives, it's really all over. in many unexpected places, like a lot of architecture experimentation in Africa in the 60s, I mean, everywhere. And it's interesting because, I mean, what happened after that? And of course, when you see this big book with all of this, it's like, where did all this go? You know, because we're teaching not as well at that time, and what all these architects became. And I think that I mean, there's a correlation probably, but this is going to be very long, between, you know, the 80s and the rise of oil market, and, you know, and everything, with this kind of like shutdown of the radical pedagogies that could have made other type of architectures. And since the late 90s, architecture, as you know, has been concentrated on marketable objects. I mean, basically, you know, there's no architect in the past almost like 30 years, maybe the new generation is I mean, surely it's changing, but that didn't want to become Norman Foster or whatever, you know. But actually, you know, these guys are not really so interesting when we're talking about architecture. So I think that there could be all types of initiatives from other schools that maybe wouldn't resemble to this. They would be something different. But and yeah, the authorship, we clearly have no system of competition or how to choose projects. So it is a diluted authorship for sure. I mean, so I'm just one of the members of the whole team, and I just facilitate things. I don't do much.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Tomasz, and I'm a PhD candidate here in the international department. Actually, thanks for the really fantastic talk. And I was wondering whether you could maybe expand a bit more on the distinction which was introduced by Professor Leander about this focus on elite, exclusive spaces on the one hand, and maybe on the more everyday, mundane spaces from the perspective of your respective projects. So why, sort of from your project's perspective, what was the rationale behind focusing maybe on recentering the political into the everyday centers, or on the other hand, on reenacting or reperforming the sort of elite exclusive spaces? What's the sort of rationale behind the choices? Thank you.
Maybe we take a last question.
Yeah, it might not be very well articulated, but I will try my best. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Dorota. I'm a PhD in anthropology and also an architect. And when I was listening and admiring all your work, I clearly, and these things have been already said, that, you know, Daniel and Stefan, you are working with voluntary, experimental, performative kind of diplomacy and collectivity that is generated through the spaces. Sometimes the spaces are kind of produced, whereas Anna's project promises to kind of work with materiality and with the kind of singular objects that are going to be inserted very deeply into, you know, into spaces of power, whereby Daniel's and Stefan's projects seem to be working, you know, and designing utopia and designing collectivity through space or through, you know, a performance. So I guess what I'm trying to lead to a question here. My question is of how do you see, and each one of you, how do you see that dialectic between processes which are potentially fairly difficult to bring together? I mean, how each one of you see kind of inserting each other's lessons into the other project. So back to the conversation and interdisciplinary. Thank you very much.
No more questions? No. So, Daniel, you start.
I'm not really sure that I really understood your question, actually. You were asking about exclusive spaces?
Yeah, because sort of, I think especially Stefan's project focused on reenacting a quite exclusive elite space to make it more participatory, but also sort of recentering the focus on an open space, more in line or more public space, which is not limited in terms of access, is sort of more democratic in its essence. It's a different exercise. So I wonder about the rationality or the reasoning behind choosing one, sort of trying to recreate the elite processes from the inside and sort of achieving sort of political change through that. And on the other hand, focusing on more public processes and more public spaces and sort of recentering the political to another space which we maybe don't associate normally with decision making, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not so sure that I'm the one that should answer that. Maybe Anna or Stefan can answer. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can reflect on that. Yes, it is about, in a way, and that is utopian, yes, can we imagine we are ourselves in this position representing, I don't know, Alibaba or Google or one of the big companies that may be in a power position in Davos, and for a moment, how would I take a decision there? So I guess the function that I see in this thing is that you, in a way, you rehearse, anticipate, and you understand the other once you're kind of stepping into their shoes. I guess that's the role play function in these things. It works as much for the exclusive spaces as it does, I think, for identifying with a country that is very underprivileged in the World Climate Conference. I talked to people that I met 2 years after them being a member of the World Climate Conference, or our World Climate Conference in Hamburg. And they said, they actually still now, they were Sudan back then, and now they're always like reflecting on news that they saw from this perspective that is so far away from their Hamburgian privileged reality. Even though they would be in the position of a politician, they would be in a position of a politician. They're not electing themselves. So I guess this is the kind of everyday theater mechanism that we try to install in these spaces.
I can maybe jump on the other, if that's okay. Again, because I have to make one clear statement, is that we are within the institution of the EPFL. The students choose to go to the EPFL, but they don't choose to do this program. So I think that's quite fundamental, because again, it's a bit different than a pure participatory exercise or experimentation or process that you would live in a public space. But I think the interesting thing is that once they are in this institution, then they start to be trained, and that's also one of the things that they learn. To come back to what we learn as well, is that you need every one of them. So now that there are construction on site, there are moments that are incredibly beautiful. Is when the ones who were really bad, in the studios, become excellent on the construction site. And those are beautiful moments. And I mean, we have now one that has been kind of like a bad student up till now, and then all of a sudden he's the hero of everyone. And what does that say, about our society and community? And then there's the whole thing about evaluation, but that would be another chapter. But I think that's very interesting. And yes, the most difficult thing is just believing the process. I mean, and not in the result. And this is something that is very, very crucial, because I mean, we clearly live in a moment where the result image and the image has, prevails pretty much everything. So you want to have this immediacy of a result very, very quickly. And in all of these processes that we're talking about, I think there's no possibility of imagining or seeing what's going to be built at the end. So I think that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. I just again sort of zoom in on our project and the way we've dealt with these choices, and on the question of why the mundane. I think we always come from somewhere, and if you think of where I come from, of course the world of high politics is the most important world, and actually the only one, and it's very problematic in many ways. If you think about how violence, which here is the concern, prevention of violence, how we can actually prevent violence. And it's not, we could have done a similar project, and people have, of course, done that as well. It's not even hypothetical. Of course, you could work with similar kinds of approaches and think about diplomacy. It's just, it seems, so when you make these kinds of choices, you make them in a context where you're speaking, you want to contribute something that you think is important. And in my case, I think it's very important for politics and international relations specifically to shift towards the quotidian, mundane, and so on, and realize the way it's important. And of course, nothing is ever out of context. So that context itself, the fact that the ICRC is present in Arauca is, of course, related. It's a political choice and so on. So, the spaces aren't somehow distinct spaces unconnected, and making those connections and pulling them out, I think, is also very important. I would never say it doesn't matter what happens in diplomacy. That's not the point. But it's just, where the choices we make have something to do where we think we want to contribute, and that has something to do with where we come from. So that's a very brief answer, and maybe that's also a reason. So I'm very grateful, actually, Stefan. I think it's great that the work you're doing is extremely important, and in bringing that world, which is the world I'm trying to sort of downtone, but bringing that in your world, of course, it doesn't have the same kind of space and so on. So I think that maybe speaks a little bit to those choices. And then I wanted to say something. Thank you, Dorota, for that excellent question, and it piggybacks a little bit back to the issues of power. And I think maybe this sounds. So for me, there's no world outside. So it's always a question of negotiating. And actually, for me, the idea of working with. So, it's almost an aim to be co-opted by power. And I just wrote the speculative, because this is I said before, I feel like it's number 300 of the grant proposal we write, but it's not quite true, but it's been a little while. So in my extreme frustration, I just contribute to a handbook on expertise about a speculative piece of what would need to change for us to be able to actually do interdisciplinary transvocational work in terms of career paths and so on. It was very nice. I was writing about a report that was published in 24, 10 years on, whatever. Not 20, what was it, 2034, and then 10 years on. So, and what had changed, and sort of speculating about what kind of changes would be necessary to get away from individualized, like to make radical pedagogy possible, but also diminish the role of authorship in academia, the way we conceive of it for the career path. And also the format is very important, because of course it's very nice we're planning exhibitions and so on, but I also need to look in the face that the researchers on this project need to have careers and find jobs, and therefore publish also in a very conventional format that has all kinds of things staked against the kind of against radical pedagogy. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having difficulties with the word, but also form, but also in terms of substance, and also in terms of the individualization, and also in terms of then getting grants. And Daniel, it's so refreshing, the rejection of the market mechanisms and so on. But everyone in this room, of course, knows that had I not gotten the SNSF grants on very conventional terms, no one would be doing the work in my project. Similarly for you, had you not gotten the grant or the job that gives you the possibility. So we're all sort of thoroughly inside this extremely commodified form of production of knowledge. So, it really is a challenge to, and I think of it, you asked, how do you think about it? I think of it as constantly negotiating that and trying to sort of push it out, whilst knowing that, we're inside and not outside. So we have to live with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panelists. To conclude, I would say a couple of things. First, Daniel and Augustin was here encourage us to go and visit the construction site after this event. I think I'm going to go, and you're welcome to go. There's also an inauguration day-long party that starts at the Museum of the Red Cross on June 1st, and there are concerts and a lot of things happening during that day in the park around the constructions. And here too, it would be nice to see you there. The last thing, I mean, we would need more conversations, because you raised a lot of issues about teaching that, in a sense, put what we are doing into question, the question of evaluation, which is super important. And I could see how a class on that type of architecture and IOs could be very useful for us at the Institute. So I hope we'll continue the conversation and expand the circle of panelists that will contribute to this conversation, and that can have transformative effects in how we teach and how we publish, actually. So more to be seen. The last thing to really conclude, it's a yes or no question for you, Daniel. I find it very poetic. The picture of the wood installation on water. I was wondering, is it photoshopped? That, that it's struck by a boat?
No.
No, it's not photoshopped. So I guess maybe the next installation will be on the lake. You've moved from the Red Cross to the garden. So I look forward to having a public space on Lake Léman in front of the UN beach. And see you there. Thank you very much.